related to item 6C. Those could come under public comment. Otherwise, they weren't agendized for today, and we will be sending them out, making them available for board review after the meeting. So that's the announcements, acknowledgements, and correspondence.
Thank you. Any questions from board members on any of these? If you'd use the Zoom raise hand. Otherwise, we'll move to roll call. I'm not seeing any hands, so Harry, would you call the roll, please?
Sure. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
you might want to lean in, Harry.
Sure. Supervisor Jane Parker.
Here.
Supervisor John Phillips.
Here.
Supervisor Mary Adams.
She's here, but hold on, let's see. Unmute. There you go.
I'm here.
Yes.
Thank you.
Councilmember John Gagliotti.
Here.
Councilmember Frank O'Connell.
Oh, where's Frank? That's right. He was here.
See Frank at the bottom, but not sure if it's him.
I'm not seeing Frank. He was here before, and he was in closed. Was he in closed session?
Mm-hmm.
We might have lost Frank. Okay, I'll send Frank an email, try to help him get back on here, but go ahead, Harry.
Mayor Pro Tem Gail Morton.
Here.
Councilmember Alan Hoffa.
Here.
Mayor Ian Oglesby.
Here.
Councilmember John Wizard.
Here.
Mayor Marianne Carbone.
Here.
Mayor Joe Gunter.
Here.
Councilmember Cynthia Garfield.
Here.
Councilmember Jan Reimers.
Here.
Catherine Moon. Colleen Courtney. Erica Parker. Debbie Hale.
Here.
Dr. P.K. Dickenbaugh.
Here.
Steve Matarazzo.
Here.
Dr. Eduardo Ochoa.
Here.
Colonel Gregory Ford.
Here.
Bill Collins. David Martin.
Here.
Lisa Reinheimer. Keith Vandermountain. We have a quorum.
Thank you. We will move now to our business items. And the first two are second votes. So the first one is a second vote on the habitat set aside. I guess, are there any board members who want to ask any questions about this? I see Gail Morton's hand raised. Yes, please.
So just in the habitat set aside, I know that this was an allocation by acreage and responsibilities, and I did support that. And I had just one question. If in fact there are transfers, be it now or in the future, of habitat management areas that are included within the acreage of any entity, if they're transferred to another jurisdiction, would those jurisdictions also allocate funds?
Great. Thank you for that question. And let's leave that on pause for a moment. I completely jumped over the staff's commitment to recap where we are. So let me hand it back to staff, and then I'll ask, we can work on your question and any others that people have. Sorry about that.
That's no problem, Chair. Thank you. I'm sharing my screen. Can everyone see the screen? Okay. So the slide I have is really just meant to remind everyone of, we had the robust discussion on the two items, and we sort of went kind of back and forth and took them together. And then there were two votes taken, both significant majorities in the direction of alternative 1 for the habitat set aside and scenario 1 for the bond proceeds. Those are shown here. And so that is the, for the meeting process, the second vote would be on going with the alternative 1 for the habitat and scenario 1 for the bond proceeds. And I think they're both represented with total numbers and percentages. So I think to the question that Gail raised, the percentage is, is reflected based on in the habitat based on acreage of habitat management, and in the bond proceeds based on building removal need as of the FORA staff estimate in December.
Thank you. Okay, so let's see. So Director Morton, did the executive officer's comments answer your question at all, or do you have further, did you want further illumination?
Hold on.
And Josh, are you done with the
yeah, I think just to be more specific, I understand that the question at hand is related to the planned conveyance of the landfill parcel from the county to Marina. The landfill parcel is a habitat management area, and so the question was brought up basically if that habitat management area, which would be accounted for in the county's 80%, whatever percentage of the acreage that represents, if that was conveyed to Marina before FORA's sunset, could there be an adjustment accordingly in the habitat funds provided to Marina, if I'm correct? Is that right, Gail?
Yes, that is the question, because I think we're in the process of trying to have that transfer happen. So if it's 1% of the county's land, then we would be asking, would 1% of the county, of the total, transfer to Marina in the allocation?
Yeah, and I guess I would say that this is probably something that would be negotiated between Marina and the county in the process of that transfer negotiation, not really something that I mean, I think if the county and Marina agreed to that, the two member jurisdictions could come back to the board, FORA board, and ask that be changed, or could just, work out that agreement between ourselves. I think there are a number of negotiations that may happen either before FORA sunsets or after that just need to be worked out between the jurisdictions. It's kind of my sense, rather than trying to figure all of that out at this point, but that's just kind of right off the top of my head. Are there any, okay, I see some hands. Let's see. I see Kendall Flint's hand, and then Alan Hoffa.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just wanted to reiterate that during the admin committee meeting, this came up specifically, and the direction that was given from the admin committee was that if the transfer takes place prior to the sunset of FORA, that the funds allocated by jurisdiction would be adjusted accordingly. If it happens post FORA, then it is a negotiation between the county and the city of Marina.
Great.
That was their recommendation.
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Alan Hoffa.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I guess I have a point of clarification because when I'm looking at what Josh is sharing under the bond proceeds, I thought that was option 2, and we voted on option 1, which is my recollection is we voted on option 1, which kind of set aside TMC, MST, and Marina Coast, and that basically it was left up to the jurisdictions to work out with those other entities how much or if they wanted to fund those demolitions. That's my recollection, but I think it'd be helpful.
If I might, Director Hoffa, I would say that you could be potentially conflating the discussion around the habitat funds with the bond proceeds. The bond proceeds have been explicit about the, because we were able to model the building removal needs specific for TAMC, MST, and MCWD, those have always been included as a special call out, as they are kind of put here. But there was discussion in the habitat around whether or not to include the parks, the state parks, and then the universities, and the action was, as shown here in alternative 1, specifically allocating the funds to jurisdictions.
Great, thank you. If there are no other board member questions at this point, I'll open it up to the public. Any members of the public wanting to comment on, we're looking at both the habitat allocation and the bond proceeds, but we're only going to be voting on the habitat one at the moment. So I see Wendy Strimling has her hand raised. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to point out that to the extent if there was going to be an adjustment based on the land transfer between the county to Marina, that it isn't a straight percentage, that option 1 is based on not only the amount of acreage, but also the type of acreage. So when you look, so that if there was going to be a transfer, it should be based on the option 1 formula, which took into account whether it's a habitat management area or a borderland, or, you know, they had the 4 different categories.
Yeah, so this is a summary slide. The details of the alternative is included and was included in last week's packet, is included in this week's packet. It's part of the attachments for the item and the ICF modeled habitat needs. So the details about what Wendy's mentioned are shown there.
Thank you. Any other members of the public wishing to comment on this item? Raise a question, make a comment. I'm not seeing any other hands for the public, and I see Director Morton's hand is raised. Go ahead.
So I would make a motion that we approve the habitat consistent with alternative 1 on the slide that is colored here in front of us, with the addition that if there are transfers of property with habitat management areas prior to June 30th or on June 30th, 2020, that the allocation be adjusted in conformity with how these allocations were established. And to answer that, Ms. Stremling just told us it's not only acreage, but it's what's the responsibility.
Okay, so it's the motion from last time.
Wait, Chair,
Enhanced.
Chair, as a point, Chair, as a point of order, yeah, shouldn't we be just voting a second vote on the initial motion?
That's right. This is a second vote.
Let's check with council. How does that work here at FORA?
Yeah, this is a second vote. You're voting on the same motion that you voted on last meeting. There should be no amendment to that motion. So I would, with due respect to Councilmember Morton, I don't think that's an appropriate deviation from the second vote procedure that we've always followed.
Then I will withdraw the motion. Thank you for the clarification.
Thank you.
And
Anyone else? Go ahead, Director Phillips.
I'd move that we go ahead with the motion as was originally proposed.
There's a motion to vote again on the motion that was made last time for the allocation laid out in alternative 1. Is there a second?
Second, I'll second. John Gagliardi.
Thank you. There's a motion and a second. Any further discussion by board members? I don't see any hands, but I'm gonna talk slowly. Okay, seeing none. Harry, would you give us a roll call vote, please?
Sure. Mayor Ian Oglesby.
Aye.
Supervisor Jane Parker.
Aye.
Supervisor Mary Adams.
Aye.
Supervisor John Phillips.
Aye.
Councilmember Frank O'Connell.
Aye.
Councilmember Alan Hoffa.
Yes.
Councilmember John Wizard.
Aye.
Mayor Joe Gunter.
Aye.
Councilmember Janet Reimers.
Aye.
Councilmember John Gagliardi.
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Gail Morton.
Aye.
Mayor Marianne Carbone.
Aye.
Councilmember Cynthia Garfield. Motion passes unanimously.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Our next item is the second vote on the bond proceeds.
Pardon me, Chair. There was one, I don't know how important it is, but there was one of the recommendations that we didn't really get into at the last meeting was approving the meeting minutes from the last Habitat Working Group. If you want to tie that up, I don't know if it's relevant here anymore, but.
So we'll take a first vote on approving the minutes from the Habitat Working Group.
I make a motion to, John Gagliardi. I'll go ahead and make a motion that we accept the meeting minutes from the last Habitat Working Group.
This is Oglesby. I second it.
Great, thank you. Motion by Gagliardi, second by Oglesby. Any questions or comments from board members on those meeting minutes? Any members of the public wanting to comment on the meeting minutes of the Habitat Working Group that are before us? I think it's 2 meetings.
Yeah, it's 2 meetings. Sorry. It's the 13th and the 27th.
Excellent. I'm not seeing any hands raised from the public, so I'll bring it back to this board for action. Any further discussion on the motion? All right, Mr. Tregenza, would you call the roll for a vote, please? Thank you.
Sure. Mayor Ian Oglesby.
Aye.
Supervisor Jane Parker.
Aye.
Supervisor Mary Adams.
Aye.
Supervisor John Phillips.
Aye.
Councilmember Frank O'Connell.
Aye.
Councilmember Alan Hoffa.
Aye.
Councilmember John Wizard.
Aye.
Mayor Joe Gunzer,
Aye.
Councilmember Janet Reimers,
Abstain, I don't attend.
Councilmember John Gagliotti,
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Gail Morton,
Aye.
Mayor Marianne Carbone,
Aye.
Councilmember Cynthia Garfield.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good catch,
All right.
Josh. All right, so now we'll move to item 6B, the building removal bond allocation. This again is a second vote. And I think, so on the, Josh, do you want to speak to this?
Yeah,
Okay.
just as we discussed, there were a few different alternatives considered. There was a letter from the county with a reallocation and a request, and the majority of the board last time voted in favor of staying with the allocations from December 2019. Those are shown here under bond proceeds scenario 1.
Great, thank you. Are there any board member comments or questions? I see Director Phillips has his hand up, so please go ahead, and after him, Director Hoffa.
Yeah, I think that the allocations to the county were clearly under what they should have been. And by tying this with the habitat that occurred, but I can count, but I don't, by tying the two together, it was a disadvantage to the county, and I don't think it was appropriate. So, thank you.
Thank you. Director Hoffa.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I have to say, I really don't believe this is the option 1 that we voted on. I don't know if it's possible for me to share my screen. I've got the agenda from the last meeting up.
I could do that if you want. There, you should be able to do that.
All right, so this was the agenda report from the meeting last Thursday. And so, and honestly, it's no skin off my back either way. I just think it's a matter of being clear on what we voted on. I'm pretty sure we voted on option 1, which was the allocation was 60% for Marina, 32% for Seaside, 8% for the county. And then these other buildings were, as I understand this chart anyway, it would be up to the jurisdictions to negotiate with those groups.
Oh, pardon me, Alan. What you're showing, this is from this is a presentation that was, the question last week was to review the methodology of how we got to how the recommendation was arrived at and voted on by the board in December. This was from a consideration by the admin committee, and it showed the 3 ways that they looked at getting to a recommendation. They then chose option 3 and recommended that for the board, and that's what the board approved in December.
Well, that is not the way that I understood the meeting, but I don't know. I guess if everybody else understood that, then I stand corrected. I'll go with the majority.
Let's see. So let's hear from Debbie Hale, and then Josh, I was going to ask you if you could speak to how that option 3 that we just saw, how that relates to option 1 that you were showing on your screen. But let's hear from Debbie Hale first.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To the issue raised, I wanted to note that I specifically asked the question at the last meeting regarding option 1 as to whether whether TAMC and the other entities were A, lumped into one group, or B, we're going to have to negotiate with the underlying jurisdictions, and the question was answered that no, they had just been lumped in one group for explanation purposes, but they would get their own fixed share, as was noted in further down into the documentation. So that was certainly my understanding at the time. Otherwise, I would have made additional comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Josh, and then if other board members have questions or comments, please raise your hand in the Zoom meeting.
So the question that you want me to address is, what is the relationship between the slide that Director Hoffa was showing and the one that I'm showing here, or I was showing?
Yes.
Okay. Let me see if I can get it set up here. Give me a second.
And maybe, and then also maybe how that relates to what Director Hale just said.
Yeah. So this presentation was from September of 2019 that the admin committee used as the basis for discussing a recommendation to the board. Let's see here. Okay. And this was the summary slide that looked at 3 ways that the allocation of the bond proceeds were considered by the admin. One was looking at as a percentage of blight, and specifically providing those funds directly to the jurisdictions. Option 2 was a percentage of tax increment generated by the different jurisdictions. And option 3 was an estimate of building removal cost, and explicitly including the items shown here. The waste treatment plant, which is actually owned by MCWD and located on state park property across Highway 1. Then there was a 4th Street storage area that's owned by MCWD. There was a 1st Street Transit Center and storage that's owned by MST, and then the 1st Street Transit Center owned by TAMC. And those were, this was the recommended way that it was brought to the board. And then if we look back at the what the board recommended in December, it was based on these percentages here. And so that's what we that's what we represented here. So 50% for Marina, 32% for Seaside, 32.3, TAMC, MST, and MCWD lumped together. This was really for simplicity of the slide, is 13.3. I think, so that would be adding all of these numbers together. And the county at 4.5%.
So basically what we see here as scenario 1, that was the December 13th, 2019 decision of the FORA board,
right,
is its background information is that option 3 that the administrative committee recommended.
Correct.
Okay, so so yeah, okay, great, thank you. Any other board questions or comments before I open it up to the public? I'm not seeing any hands, so I will ask the public. Are there any members of the public who would like to ask a question or make a comment on this bond allocation question? I'm not seeing any hands, so I'll bring it back to this board.
Jane. Woohoo, Jane.
Oh, I'm sorry. The hand that you raised, Ron, never got, it never came before my eyes. Ron Cheshire, please.
No, we're on behalf of the Monterey Santa Cruz Building Trades Council, we're glad to see you're moving forward with this. I think it's a demonstration by FORA that you can work together Thank God. And I will quote something to you from the Authority Act. It's 67683. It says the board shall aggressively pursue all possible federal funding for the transfer, cleanup, and reuse of Fort Ord. And I'll just leave it at that, is that you may want to look into that one section of the Authority Act. And I will have you know that we have mentioned it several times, is that the federal government through our congressmen ought to be apprised of what's taking place, and that we ought to pursue additional funds so all the blight will be removed, therefore taking care of everyone's situation and making Fort Ord a place that is ready for economic development, and with no hindrance, at least as far as blight is concerned. We have been in talks with our congressmen, and I hope we can all move forward with getting all the blight removed. I know that it was difficult for you to come to an allocation that's not 100% for each jurisdiction, but that's just the way it works out. So let's move forward from here and see what we can do. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else from the public whose hand I didn't originally see? All right, I'll bring it back to this board. I see Director Morton has her hand up.
So I would move approval of the methodology for the bond allocation set forth in scenario 1 as it appears on the screen in front of us, as a second vote on the same allocation we did last week, excuse me.
All right, there's a motion by Morton. Is there a second?
I'll second it, John Gagliotti.
Great, thank you. Second by Gagliotti. Any further discussion by board members? Please raise your hand in the Zoom area. Seeing none, Mr. Tregenza, would you help us out with a roll call vote?
Mayor Ian Oglesby,
Aye.
Supervisor Jane Parker,
Aye.
Supervisor Mary Adams,
Aye.
Supervisor John Phillips,
No.
Councilmember Frank O'Connell,
Yes.
Councilmember Alan Hoffa,
Yes.
Councilmember John Wizard,
Aye.
Mayor Joe Gunzer,
No.
Councilmember Janet Reimers,
Yes.
Councilmember Gagliotti,
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Gail Morton,
Yes.
Mayor Marianne Carbone,
Yes.
Councilmember Cynthia Garfield.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Let's move now to, I'm going to take the next two items out of order. 6D is talking about what the mechanism is going to be to make the Habitat Funds distribution that we have just voted on. And since that decision will be reflected in the transition plan, it might just be useful to talk about the mechanism first. So Josh, do you have a presentation on this one?
Yeah, so this is going to be led by our Authority Counsel, David Willoughby, and who has been the main guy working on the question of how these funds could be transferred under the Community Facility District rules. So John, I'm not seeing David on the call. Is he here? Go ahead, John.
He should be on.
Yeah, I'm here. I just had a little
There he is.
difficulty
Okay.
unmuting myself.
Okay, great, David.
Okay, well, there is a memorandum in your packet that describes the three fundamental ways that we looked at possibly transferring funds that had been accumulated through the Community Facilities District special taxes. The first group involves the transfer of the funds which had been collected and aggregated for use in a cooperative base-wide endeavor to deal with habitat management, would have moved those funds as one aggregated sum from FORA to a joint powers authority that had been created for the purpose of carrying forward that cooperative habitat management effort. However, when it became available or became apparent that the member jurisdictions were not prepared to commit today to doing cooperative habitat management through the form of the JPA that had been discussed, option one really became not a viable approach. So we set that aside and moved on to approach number two, which would be authorized under the same act that dealt with transfer of the aggregated funds from FORA to a joint powers authority. The twist in approach number two is that a series of joint community facilities agreements would be entered into between FORA and each jurisdiction that would receive a portion of the CFD funds. So it would be a series of agreements instead of one agreement. The gist of each agreement would be the commitment of the jurisdiction receiving the funds to expend them for the purposes for which they had been collected. Essentially, habitat management in a somewhat expanded definition to include administrative costs, the costs of further studies, legal fees, those sorts of things. But that would be the commitment made by the receiving jurisdiction, would be to spend the money properly. The commitment by FORA would be to transfer the money in the proportions that we've just discussed. And that would be the mechanism by which the funds would be transferred. The third approach would be to do the same thing, have a series of agreements between FORA and recipients, but not necessarily tie them into the framework of the Mello-Roos Act. That one is a little bit less charted territory. We don't have a statute or a set of regulations that we can point to that explicitly say such an approach is authorized. We have not been able to find anything that say that such an approach would be prohibited. But the advantage that I see in taking approach number two over approach three is we do have that statutory framework that we can look to and point to as justification for handling the transfer of the funds in the manner proposed, because it does fit within the rubric that's already established under the Community Facilities Act. So that in a nutshell is the range of options that we looked at. Another attachment to your board package is a initial draft template of a joint community facilities agreement so that you can see the kinds of provisions that we would put into that. And if anybody wants to at this stage, we could walk through this, or we could just acknowledge that we have a template here and that it's going to be subject to some negotiation with the recipient jurisdictions, and perhaps save the more detailed review when we get to the point that we think we're ready to sign agreements.
Thank you for that presentation. And so, David, am I understanding correctly that this agreement template is an expression of option two?
You are correct.
Great.
We more or less abandoned the effort to put together or finalize the joint powers agreement. I did not draft anything yet for approach number three. This is the embodiment of approach two.
Seems pretty straightforward. And so I don't think that county council has had a chance to look at this? So you just said this is kind of a template, but people haven't necessarily looked at it and vetted the language and all that good stuff. That's still to come.
Correct. I only recently got this for a staff and actually haven't even completed an internal review of it. But given the short time we have remaining, I thought it would be good to at least get the basic points out for review and discussion by the member jurisdictions. And I expect we'll receive feedback from them to refine this into something that would be mutually acceptable.
Okay, great. And all that the board is being asked to do today is to say yes or no about, or to choose which mechanism it's going to be, not that we would be approving any specific document.
Right.
You are correct.
Okay, great. So other board member questions, since I just jumped in and hogged the limelight. I see Cynthia Garfield has raised her hand. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I haven't been party to these conversations for the habitat, but this seems like there's an administrative aspect to this. Who would administer? How would it get rolled out? Is there a simpler way, perhaps, by having FORA create a liability for the amount for each jurisdiction, and then LAFCO pays it out as a legitimate payment of a FORA debt? I guess it's a legal question.
Yeah, that sort of gets into what I tried to discuss in option 3. We don't know that other approaches such as that would be prohibited, but we don't have a very solid example saying it's authorized. The advantage to doing it through a joint community facilities agreement is we can kind of hang our hat on the statute and say, we've moved these funds around in the way that the statute envisioned that they would be moved. That isn't to rule out the possibility of a simpler agreement. It just might be a little less certain that it would be legitimate.
Okay, I appreciate the update. Thank you.
Director Morton?
Yes, so to Ms. Garfield's conversation also, this was vetted at the working group, the Habitat working group as well. And so all the different kinds of different possibilities were kind of thought through at that particular time. And Mr. Willoughby has brought before the full board what were options that he's discussed with us repetitively over multiple weeks. So if there are no other comments, I'm prepared to make a motion.
Thank you.
And I have no ability to see other hands. I see John Gagliotti, so I'll wait.
Thank you. Yes, I do see that Director Gagliotti has raised his hand. And before we take a vote, I probably would open it up to the public. So go ahead, John.
Yeah, I shared Director Morton's sentiment that, yeah, it's been pretty well vetted and we understand what we need to do. I just have one kind of question is as I see this, the individual jurisdictions are the likely way this is going to probably play out is the individual jurisdictions are going to have to come into some agreement individually with FORA. And we need to do that faster quicker than maybe we even have time. But does this template have basically the minimum amount of language that FORA would basically accept if we as our own jurisdiction, Delray Oaks, drafted an agreement and then sent it out? Or is there some reason that we need an overall document? Or that's my question. Do we need kind of a blanket document that has just the minimums of FORA and then go into drafting our own individual agreements or bilaterals with FORA?
From my perspective, there would be an advantage to each of the agreements bearing at least a strong resemblance to the others. In an ideal world, they'd all be the same and everybody could live with the template language. But, certainly there is room for adaptation to the unique circumstances faced by each of the jurisdictions. And even if these agreements do not end up being identical, that is not going to be a problem under the Melrose Community Facilities Act kind of structure. because they are independent agreements between FORA and each of the jurisdictions.
Okay, and I have one follow-on question with regard to that. Is it, what's the drop dead date that the agreement has to be completely inked between the jurisdiction and FORA? And will those individual agreements have to be accepted by the board, or can staff just accept them?
I would envision that you would need FORA acceptance on each of these by the FORA board. They would need to be approved before the funds were distributed. And of course, you need to get the funds distributed before June 30.
So we have 10 weeks to get all that done.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Any other board members wanting to ask a question? Yes, Director Adams.
Thank you. I just wanted to inquire whether or not having all of the separate joint community facilities agreements with each of the recipients of the CFD funds would be contrary to what the military has said that they would like to ensure continues, which is just one primary contact for all of the issues that we deal with.
From my perspective, that desire to have one contact was related to issues such as incidental take permits and the abandonment of a cooperative effort. I think is going to a large part bring to an end the possibility of speaking through only one voice to the military. But I would defer to information that the environmental consultants may have that might shed further light on that.
Yeah, so if I might add a comment there, the single point of contact with the U.S. Army and the federal government pertains particularly to the ESCA and the local redevelopment authority designation that they will now have. The question on habitat involves the feds and the state, the feds through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And another item on today's agenda is a communication that they've requested we provide about this new direction that the board is taking by way of distributing the funds and leaving open the possibility that there could be a joint powers authority formed later to deal with habitat if the individual entities so choose. But this is a pretty significant policy change from what has been board policy for the last 25 years. So that's to your point, Mary.
Thank you.
I'm not seeing any other board member hands at this point, so I'll open it up to the public. Are there any members of the public who would like to comment on this?
Seeing Gage Dayton.
Yes, I see Gage Dayton. Please, your turn.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to chime in. So Gage Dayton, Fort Ord Natural Reserve, University of California, Santa Cruz, and we've worked hard on habitat related issues over the last decade. And I do think it's unfortunate we couldn't move forward with a collaborative approach. But of the option number 2 and number 3, I'm glad that there seems to be consensus that these funds are going to be allocated with specific requirements to manage the habitat. And just wanted to let everyone know that we are here and we look forward to working with you and helping in any way we can as far as your habitat management studies and research go into the future.
Thank you. Sherry Damon is next.
Yes, thank you, Chair, members of the board. I will say that in looking at the facilities agreement attachment B, I really haven't spent a lot of time with it and would like the opportunity to look at the provisions of that more carefully and thoroughly. Conceptually, I think individual agreements using the provisions of the Mello-Roos Act is probably the most defensible from my hat. However, I think that option 3 also could be used fairly easily using kind of a hybrid approach. So I can tell that there are going to be some provisions in option 2, the attachment 2, that would need, from at least my hat, some revision.
Thank you. Any other members of the public? And if you're raising your hand and I'm not seeing you, speak up, because I'm not seeing any hands right now. So I'll bring it back to this board. So the action needed is to approve a mechanism, and I think it's understood that the draft agreement it's just a draft. It's there to show what direction we might go, and that legal counsel for each of the jurisdictions would be taking a much closer look at it before it gets agreed to by anybody. Is there anyone who'd like to make a motion? Oh, I see Director Morton has her hand up.
So I would like to make a motion that we received the report we did, and that we select the mechanism, which is the Joint Communities Facilities Agreement with each recipient of CFD funds, consistent with the intention set forth in attachment B, which of course will be modified and reviewed by each of the jurisdictions and by FORA as appropriate.
I'll second that, John Gagliotti.
Thank you. We have a motion by Morton, a second by Gagliotti. Is there any further discussion? Seeing no hands raised, Mr. Tregenza, would you give us a roll call vote, please?
Mayor Ian Oglesby.
Aye.
Supervisor Jane Parker.
Aye.
Supervisor Mary Adams.
Aye.
Supervisor John Phillips.
Aye.
Councilmember Frank O'Connell.
Aye.
Councilmember Alan Hoffa.
Aye.
Councilmember John Wizard.
Aye.
Mayor Joe Gunzer. Mayor Joe Gunter still on?
Let's see. Not seeing him.
I don't see him.
Okay. Councilmember Janet Reimers.
Aye.
Councilmember John Gagliotti.
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Gail Morton.
Aye.
Mayor Marianne Carbone.
Aye.
Councilmember Cynthia Garfield.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's good to see these things moving along. We'll back up now to business item 6C, which includes some proposed changes to the transition plan language.
Yeah, so our transition plan consultant extraordinaire, Kendall Flint, will be leading this item, and I believe she's ready to go. You ready to go, Kendall?
I am ready to go.
All right.
Before I share my screen, I just wanted to remind the board that this came before the board at your March 12th meeting, and we ran through the list of proposed changes. One of the things that the board asked was for us to not make a change, but to in fact record the master resolution, and staff has moved forward with that. I don't know if it has actually been recorded, but I know that CAGLA has submitted it to the county. So that master resolution moves forward. At your April 9th meeting, we didn't have an opportunity to go through these other proposed changes, and we did receive some requests for some amendments in the interim. So what I'd like to do with the chair's permission is open up the actual document so we can basically walk you through the whole thing and then come back and take questions by section if that is appropriate. So let me share my screen. So I'm going to just go to the places where there were changes that were requested. And just as a reminder, the entire board was provided with the a version of this on April 3rd. And then when we made these additional changes, those were provided on the 15th in the morning. The first change, which was added in the interim between those meetings, was on section O. There's a specific line that discusses that these agreements, this particular transition plan and these agreements that were in existence prior, this would be the 2001 implementing agreements between all your agencies, that those agreements would be superseded by transition plan implementing agreements signed in 2020. A reminder, that is not this agreement. This is an update to the transition plan, but it includes the language that specifies that those 2001 agreements would be superseded by the 2020 TPIAs. The first change is in section 1.1, and we had a request for removing everything after, to the extent these policies and programs survive the dissolution of FORA. If you can look in the strikeout, it's also available in your agenda packages. It basically just took out pieces that referenced other plans which had not happened. So there are no other negotiating tools that were required. So that was a suggestion for removal. When we met last, we did discuss moving, as we put this is 1.3. This section basically says the FORA will record the master resolution, which of course we are doing at that point. 1.4 basically addresses the ESCA, the Environmental Services Cooperative Agreement, and mentions that we have now nominated the city of Seaside. There were no changes to section 1.5 other than changing the number because other sections were removed. When we move to sections 2.0, this is the assignment of assets, liabilities, and obligations. Now you'll notice here in 2.1.1, and this is global throughout the document, we've removed any references to any successor to FORA. The only time we hear the word or read the word successor in this document is as it pertains specifically to the city of Seaside taking over the LRA and ESCA responsibilities. As we go here to 2.1.3, this section was updated to reflect the actual funds that had been submitted to our friends at LAFCO and references the December 18th, 2019 agreement that FORA entered into with LAFCO. Section 2.1.4 reflects the board's most recent action to allocate funds to the various agencies at the level and percentages that were approved and on second vote today. So that reflects the most recent information. Section 2.1.5 relates specifically to the transfer of funds that will go to the city of Marina, I believe it's Marina, Delray Oaks, and county. I think it's county. Sorry, thank you. For any CIP projects. And in this section, there is a reference that adds that they must have a transition plan implementing agreement that is signed, and there must be a fully executed memorandum of understanding between FORA and the specific agency. And what that line does is it basically ties the use of the funds for the project for which they were intended in the CIP. We anticipate those specific agreements coming back to the board. I think, Josh, we talked about that being at the May meeting.
Yeah, if we're working hard, there's drafts going back and forth, and as soon as they're agreeable by both parties, then or both councils, then they would come back.
So there are no changes in sections 2.1, 7, or 8. In 2.9, again, this references back to the city of Seaside, which would be taking over the allocation of real property. This is the land transfers that have not been completed by the time that FORA sunsets, that the city of Seaside would move on in that role. I'm now going down to, let's see here. All the rest of these are the same. We have deleted and I believe with the board's concurrence last time, the original section 2.2.6, transportation and transit. It listed a number of projects, programs, and investments that would be carried on post-FORA, but as has been recommended by the admin committee, and I believe by consensus with the board, those projects and programs would be under the purview of these specific jurisdictions, which would have them, and then they would make the determination if there were triggers in place, whether or not they needed to be done or not. So that section was removed. 2.2.6 has not been changed in any way. 2.2.8, we are suggesting, and it's throughout the document, the removal of Exhibit A. You may recall that is a listing of about 145 different documents or contracts that the FORA is currently or had been over the years engaged with. After a review with council, we believe that all of those will have either been transferred through the MOUs to the underlying jurisdictions or will no longer be in place. So that has been updated to reflect that. The previous section 3 related to 2 insurance issues, which were basically tail coverage and another type of coverage that staff would have been presenting to the board in March of 2019. As neither of those happened or are going to happen, we're suggesting that that section is removed. Transition plan implementation agreements, which was previously section 4, is now section 3. And that has been edited to more specifically just say that the TPIAs are established to clarify the roles and responsibilities post-FORA, and the board requests that each agency or entity enter into that agreement. Removed a number of what we believe with the legal counsel were unenforceable. There are no other changes in this document except for, of course, the date. And then following in the back end in glossary, we did add a section that was requested regarding the phrase local redevelopment authority to specify that this is only as it pertains to recognition by the Secretary of Defense and the Office of Economic Adjustment, and only applies to federal LRA and not to state. So with that, I'm available to take any questions. I can certainly come back to any sections that you would like to review further, but I send it back to the chair.
Thank you, Ms. Flint. Any board members with questions, please raise your hands in the Zoom area. Director Hoffa.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I had a question about, I think it's 1.3, where it just, if you could move to that, where it discusses the reuse plan and the master resolution.
Yep.
And so my question, I guess, is the language there, it says FORA will record the master resolution in its entirety, et cetera. That's good. But what I don't understand is why we added the language that follows. Recording the master resolution is not intended to create any liabilities or obligations that do not already exist. The fact is, there are obligations, at least this is my understanding, there are obligations on the jurisdiction to meet their affordable housing mandate. That was a requirement of the land being transferred and of prevailing wage. So I'm not understanding why don't we just stop with the language where it says we are recording it? If there are differences of opinion about what that means, that will be worked out, I would guess, in court, but I don't think we should be implying a legal opinion by saying we're not trying to create any liabilities or obligations that don't already exist. It just seems, I just don't understand that. So I'm wondering if we could get maybe some comment from our counsel on that. What would be the effect of just eliminating the sentence there about intentionality?
I'm gonna just.
I'm looking, I'm not seeing exactly what you're.
It's actually section 1.3. And to Member Hoffa, this was the language that was actually in the original 2018. We did discuss this with David and John. I think we were kind of on the fence of it as well. We were originally suggesting that this entire section be struck because we couldn't find actually a reason for it to be recorded other than just to memorialize the fact that at one time there was this master resolution. So that's the same language as saying will record. But frankly, as staff, I do agree with you. I defer to John on that. But once the resolution is recorded, there's no agency intact to enforce, right? So we can't carry on enforcement.
That's correct. I did, by the way, just get confirmation that the master resolution has been recorded as of April 14.
Yay.
But so, John, are you saying that basically the jurisdictions, they can't enforce it, either prevailing wage or the affordable housing, but yet they approve the contracts of developers? So I guess I don't understand why they couldn't enforce since they're the ones who are approving the contracts.
Well, I'm not understanding your question really.
John, I'm going to help you out. This is the conversation we had with David. Sure. So at the point that FORA was enacted and through the state legislation, we had information that was there that was tied, right, to prevailing wage and to different types of things as it relates to housing. When FORA ceases to exist, that state mandate established by the formation of FORA goes away. The local jurisdictions are still required to meet their RENA numbers and do affordable housing and housing elements and all that outside of the FORA footprint. But if a local agency wanted to adopt a prevailing wage, a prevailing wage policy, they would need to do that as a local jurisdiction because FORA no longer has the ability to be enforcing that and can't pass that enforcement capability to the agency because their powers die on the 30th.
Yep.
Thank you. Any other board members with questions? I do have a couple of questions. Director Morton.
Go ahead. I can go after you, Jane. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. What's it? Paragraph O. There's reference to the 2001 agreements, and I thought we had determined that those didn't survive FORA, so I'm wondering why we don't just say that in this or something. And then I'm a little concerned that we're adding language saying these agreements will be superseded by the TPIAs, because I'm kind of getting the sense that there may or may not be any TPIAs if they don't get agreed to in time. So I wouldn't want to tie this to something that might not happen. So I guess I'm wondering if we can just be a little clearer here.
The question that came out of that, we actually had a couple people ask that language specifically be listed in this document so that it was very clear. I think that legal counsel and staff agree with you, Chair Parker, that once FORA ceases to exist, those agreements from 2001 are not really enforceable. That being said, there still could be some legal question about it. So the discussion was that we would go ahead and include this language as requested to give people that extra added comfort that for sure those 2001 agreements are no longer valid. But then the next question is, which I think we've talked about, what if somebody doesn't sign a transition plan implementing agreement? And I think from what legal has told us, I don't know that there's another section in this document that I have a feeling Member Morton's going to bring up that basically says, it's an example, currently in the document, it ties the ability to transfer funds for a CIP project to only those agencies that have a signed TPIA or an MOU. So I think it's to the pleasure of the board how you guys want to go forward with that. But John, did I miss anything on that?
No, I think you have it exactly right.
Well, I would just say that if the 2001 agreements die with FORA's sunset, And I think we pretty much all agree that they do. We should just come out and say that and not make anything be contingent on a TPIA, which may or may not be in place. I think just for clarity, that that makes sense to me. And then if there is a TPIA, then it might, well, I just think it's moot. I mean, they're gone. And then the other issue I had was the one you referenced, actually, in paragraph 2.1.5. I wanted to make sure that the CIP funds, so it says that there need to be agreements, fully executed memorandum of understanding between FORA. That doesn't look like it is a TPIA, but I wanted to make sure that it wasn't, that it's a different agreement between FORA and the jurisdiction.
So as an example, Chair, hypothetically, if the board wanted to, for example, remove the line that says, remove if that jurisdiction has an executed transition plan implementing agreement, and that's all gone, and just go right to fully executed memorandum of understanding. Those are the agreements that would come back to the board in May that basically tie the transition of the funds, so that I'll use, if the money is going for one project, they have to use it for that project. They can't use it for something else or general fund. And I think, frankly, all of the agencies that are looking for those CIP funds are aware of that. I don't think anyone disagrees with tying those things together, but that would be absolutely possible.
So I think sounds like the MOUs are being worked on. I would just say that we should eliminate the TPIA again. If for some reason those, I mean, what I think we're trying to do is have kind of a belt and suspenders approach, but in case the suspender or the belt, which one is which, I don't know, but I think having things rely on a TPIA that might not happen just makes things more complicated and uncertain than they need to be. So those were my comments. And so now, Director Morton. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Director Parker, you hit on exactly the points about the City of Marina is asking that any reference to the implementation agreements from 2001, and there's an amendment, that those be stricken. It appears in this document multiple times, is just as you articulated about the master resolution not being enforceable, there's nobody there to enforce it post FORA sunset. The implementation agreements are the same. And most importantly, every jurisdiction looking at this should consider those implementation agreements. If they are not voided, they are requiring you to put up your land sale revenues and also potentially other sources of revenue. So it's in everybody's best interest that we don't leave confusion and that we go forward with very specific memorandums of understanding. The second point was that the transition plan implementing agreements as being a condition for receiving any CIP funds and receiving any other funds should be taken out. And the reason being, none of us have seen them. It is now April 17th, something like that. And by the time they get seen by everybody, get reviewed by every single jurisdiction, we're going to be way beyond June 1st, if not beyond that. And I think it's important for us to get the MOU signed and the monies transferred consistent with board decisions on an element by element that we've gone through, such as Eucalyptus Road, South Boundary Road, the Stockade, the habitat management area. We just need to actually do the work and trying to tie everything into, now we're going to need a TPIA that's agreeable to every jurisdiction, is overshooting the moon. The other thing that, Kendall, when you read the definition for the local redevelopment authority, which is in the definitions, you made reference to that it's as defined in federal law. And that's what we had, but the definition that's typed in the packet at page 114 doesn't match what you articulated.
I read
about it being limited to the ESCA, completion of ESCA and the transfers.
I'm happy to add additional, the point in there was that it's recognized by the Secretary of Defense through his Office of Economic Adjustment. I actually took the definition directly from the definitions that were used for the ESCA documents, but I'm happy to amend or add additional language that you would like to suggest.
So what I'm concerned about the language that's on the screen, if you read it there, as the entity responsible, I'm reading the last two lines, as the entity responsible for developing the reuse plan. That's already happened. The Seaside is not in a position and it's not responsible for developing the reuse plan or directing the implementation of the reuse plan. They're fulfilling the functions that were identified as necessary for ESCA and for the transfer of the properties post FORA sunset. So your definition is way too broad and too empowering.
So let me ask if this works.
I thought the land was coming from the Army. FORA doesn't have title to land in my understanding.
From the Army.
But John Gibbons can clarify that.
The former Fort Ord was owned by the Army, but I can, from the Army.
Okay, I got it there, sorry. Yeah. Got it. Okay. So that was one of my questions. I have a other question about, again, you recite in the MCWD modifying, I'm reading from paragraph 2.1. What is it? 2.2.7. Your numbers are small. So you again talk about, you rely on in the last paragraph, or the last sentence of that paragraph, the implementation agreements, and it appears that would not be in there because implementation agreements are moot. We're not modifying them. So I would ask that those all be scrubbed on behalf of the city of Marina.
I think that you're correct on that, and actually I think it has to go farther up.
There's several places, and I'm not going to sit and bore you to death.
No, but I think if we strike everything from nothingness assignment all the way through to the end, none of the rest of this is actually relevant at this point, because we're not.
I would agree.
We're not looking at the 17 million anymore. It's basically just it's going to go to MCWD.
They already have it.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Garfield?
Thank you, Chair. So my question is a pretty simplistic one, is that if nobody has to sign an agreement, and I'm asking for some education here. If nobody has to sign the agreement, how do we know they're going to do what they say they're going to do? Is it the memorandums of understanding? What is it that says, here's your money, and now you're going to use it the way you said you were going to use it for the purposes that you agreed to?
So let me try to answer that, and it's going to be a simple answer, but it's also kind of an interesting one. I need to take you back to January, February of 2019. During 2018, I would say that it was perhaps the direction that the leadership had at staff level at that time, that there was going to be a way to actually tie the base reuse plan to the underlying jurisdictions in an enforceable type of way. And what we learned over the last year is that that probably was not the case. So originally the TPIAs were really set up to tie jurisdictions to commitments for everything from local road projects to infrastructure, on and on and on, and possibly even tie everyone into a community facility. What we know from working with the agencies and also working with the Habitat Working Group is that while the initial intent I think was good, right? But the thing is, if there isn't going to be an implementation of a habitat conservation plan, and there isn't going to be a JPA, and there isn't a legal mechanism for FORA to force this to happen. So when we look at the evolution of the TPIAs, and frankly, they've come before the admin committee not less than 10 times in the last 6 months, that document has been stripped down to such a level where literally the only thing in it that's relevant is basically that first line that says, this supersedes all other agreements and you are off the hook. All of the references to commitment to local roadway projects, gone. Admin last week made a recommendation about removing references to water, gone. So all these things are now no longer in place. And that was frankly one of the things that we talked about with council, is sort of like, on the one hand, why wouldn't you sign it? Because there's nothing in it. And on the other hand, why bother to sign it? Because there's nothing in it. And I wish I had a better answer for that, but we've definitely discussed that internally as well.
Okay, well, I appreciate the history on it. It's a little confusing sometimes looking at it from not being a land use jurisdiction, so maybe a little one step removed. You know, there's all these expectations that the larger community has that things are going to proceed in a constructive way for the region. And I just am a little concerned when we hear things being removed for very good reasons, is that we're not going to see things come to fruition that have been a positive or appeared to be positive for the entire region. And I guess I'm going to have to put my faith in all the land use jurisdictions that they are going to do what they said they were going to do and use the money that's been collected as intended.
Well, to put your mind at ease, that really it is always about the money. The two big money questions we talked about today, really habitat money and also funds for CIP and bond. Those monies are tied to specific things. There are legal requirements for each of those things that will make sure they have to be done. And I think too, think about it, it's not like that nothing has happened in the last 25 years. We've got a fantastic education situation here that we didn't have previously. We are going to get some of these buildings removed. We've got Joby and other people that have come into town through the economic development efforts of Josh and some of the other folks on staff. I think what we just all have to come to terms with is that the idea that FORA as a body is going to control land use jurisdictions, future development and general plans, that has ended. So that is no longer the case. Each jurisdiction will have its own ability to go through its own environmental review process, move forward as they like. But I think the most important thing, which is why we took on this effort to update the plan. The plan adopted, the transition plan adopted in 2018 did not, or today does not reflect the guidance that we've been given from all the committees and the board and the local jurisdiction. And we believe that these changes more closely align with where everybody wants to go. And it's not to say, look back and go, it's to say, look, this is a document that now is in keeping and consistent with what we know, which is on June 30th, FORA is going to go away, and we are going to now take responsibility for the region.
Thank you. You've articulated it very well. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I see that Director Reimers has her hand up, and Director Morton, is your hand up again or just still up from previously?
It's just up from previously. Just to clarify to the question that was asked by Ms. Garfield, is that the TPIA is one type of agreement, but the restrictions on the use of funds is in the memorandum of understanding that's going to be signed as to each pocket of funds. So there still is a written agreement that's going to be present and restrict the use of funds that go to, for example, the City of Marina for habitat, or the City of Marina for if it got money for a road, although we're not.
Thank you. Director Reimers?
Thank you. I share some of the comments that Cynthia said. As a non-jurisdiction community and one who depends on all of you who are the jurisdictions who will be making the decisions in the future about the land use at the former Fort Ord. There's some huge decisions coming down the pike. There are directions that many communities may choose to go, and I'm certainly hopeful that there will be an understanding of how much work has gone so far in developing the Fort Ord land in a way that's really good for the broader community. And I would just urge that to be a thought and a thought process for all the communities going forward, that this is a larger community than just the jurisdictions, and we look forward to working with you, and we look forward to having really a good deal of the plan that's already been in place going forward with Fort Ord to see carried out. So I wish you all well, and I won't be at the table to vote, so I'll be at home voting. So wish you well. Thank you.
Thank you. If there aren't any other board comments or questions at this point, I'd like to open it up to the public, and I see that Wendy Strimling has been waiting patiently for.
I saw Gail's hand go back up there, Jane. I don't know if.
Okay, we'll come back for board discussion once we hear.
That's great. I just have one more question. Sorry.
Okay, super. Wendy Strimling and then Doug Yount, please.
I had a question about section 2.1.1 relating to the CalPERS liability. I see there's no changes to that, and I think it states, maybe you could put it up there on the screen so I don't have to toggle, that so 2.1.1, maybe it's 2.2.1.
It's 2.2.1, and I do have it on the screen, Wendy. Can you see it?
I'm not sure this is the section though. It might have been the earlier section 2.1, but that it states that FORA will fully fund the CalPERS liability before it dissolves.
Actually, what it says is that it has a set aside, and then in the last sentence of this, and this is really important. It says the county shall be entitled to recover its reasonable costs for administering and distributing tax revenues, and also they can use tax revenues or sequester that for up to 5 years if there was a shortfall. Now, the Finance Committee has recommended moving additional funds over into the CalPERS liability, but we won't know what that number is until the post-FORA universe. It'll come later. So the way that this was constructed was that there was this set aside if for any reason it wasn't enough, that the county would be able to sequester additional property tax revenue to meet that demand.
Okay, would you go up to 2.1.1, because that's the section that talks about the section 115 trust?
Sure.
I mean, thank you for that clarification, Kendall, that did help, but it.
And actually, you're correct. We should probably
right there, it does say
more money.
It says FORA reserve funds and or other funds available to FORA shall be applied so as to fully satisfy the unfunded pension liability under the CalPERS contract. So is that still the case, or, I mean, so that's, I don't understand now that you point out to how those interplay.
I think what we have to do, though, to your point, we need to update this this section and find out from Helen, because I know she's been sequestering other funds. There's 2 ones out there. We can update this to reflect the numbers that are more accurate for now. But yes, the idea is that the board did vote, and FORA has been sequestering that money in an interest-bearing account to address this. But if for whatever reason it's not enough, there's a way to make up that shortfall. And then also the Finance Committee had made a recommendation, which I believe we'll be looking at the May meeting, about where to allocate any funds that have not been already applied to something.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Doug Yount?
Yes, thank you, Chair Parker. I just wanted to remind the board of the language that we submitted on behalf of Marine Community Partners relative to Section 2.26, possibly even an earlier draft. There's been a variety of changes made, but there was language submitted at the last meeting, and of course, I think this is a special continued meeting or a meeting that was set when these items were carried over. So you should have a copy of, it was an email, I believe it was sent. And the purpose of that email, the purpose of the change here to this language really boils down to two things. One, that MCWD, it's recognized in this language and really in any of the documents, MOUs, or even service agreements that MCWD will have with each jurisdiction of the water allocations that were made under the base reuse plan implementation agreements and others, the EDC, MOA, and so forth, that recognition by MCWD of those water allocations and the water allocation table itself be attached in all of the documents, so that is a consistent recognition of those allocations going forward.
If I may, Chair, for the member agencies that haven't been intimately involved in that conversation, and this is again at the discretion of the board, there is a table that is looks to be included in the TPIAs, signed or not, and there's also a copy of that is in the current ESCA and LRA agreements that tie water, and the Marina Coast Water District has a table in its documents for overall water. If it's the board's wish, we can certainly add an exhibit on this, and then to Doug's point, it would be consistent across all of those different documents, and MCWD has already agreed to those tables. Now I want to be very clear on that. That is for the potable water. We got into a much different and deeper conversation as it related to whatever future might come to pass, but we were able to get to consensus on the current allocations as preserved in the plan. So if that's direction you'd like to give, we can certainly do that.
Thank you. Any other members of the public?
I'm seeing Jonathan Brinkman and Ron Cheshire both are raising their hands.
Oh, thank you.
Manual
Yeah.
method.
Excellent. So Jonathan Brinkman and then Ron Cheshire. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, Chair Parker, members of the board. Jonathan Brinkman from LAFCO of Monterey County. LAFCO's transmitted a letter today related to this particular item. Specifically, our letter provided a copy of California Native Plant Society's letter of April 14th, 2020, which was addressed to LAFCO. CNPS's letter requested LAFCO's assistance in ensuring that FORA name and secure successors for FORA lead agency projects of South Boundary Road and General Jim Moore Boulevard, as well as for existing FORA contracts with CNPS. So LAFCO has had a number of communications with FORA asking FORA to make assignments or lead agency successor designations for CEQA lead agency projects over the past few months. We recognize that at this time, the FORA transition plan does not yet address lead agency assignments to successors, and in particular these agreements with CNPS. So we want to just appreciate the FORA board and staff's hard work on these outstanding issues, including many other dissolution items. We respectfully encourage FORA to include the following items and actions in the coming weeks. So what we would propose is to add language in the 2020 transition plan to assign the City of Delray Oaks, Marina, Seaside as FORA CEQA lead agency status successors for FORA CIP projects of South Boundary Road, the Marina Stockade, and General Jim Moore Boulevard / Eucalyptus Road. So that would be one item. A second item would be to complete work to prepare and execute individual agreements to designate each city as a FORA CEQA lead agency successor for these CIP projects before June 30th, and to add language in the 2020 transition plan to assign a successor agency for FORA's contracts with CNPS, and then finally to prepare and execute an agreement between FORA and its successor to assign FORA's contracts with CNPS to a successor. And just thank you for the comments today. Thank you.
Thank you. Ron Cheshire.
Thank you, Chair Parker. On behalf of the Monterey Santa Cruz Building Trades Council, we're very concerned in regards to how this is moving forward. You've heard us talk on it before. We all understand FORA is going to be gone. and that the individual jurisdictions are basically, well, their parcels of property. But when they got their parcels of property, certain things were implemented and they were recorded. And these are all the things that I think that maybe Ms. Garfield and Ms. Reimers might be concerned about. All the hard work that we've put into this over the last 25 years, all the agreements we've made, all the money we've spent and everything, is all of this going to go for naught just because FORA is not going to be around? Now, the last meeting at the Carpenters Hall, I will go back to the tape, but I think the consultant basically stated that since it's recorded, certain things are recorded, that those things will remain. Now I'm hearing that no, nothing's going to remain. It's just all going to go away. So we're flopping around like a fish out of water here. And we want a clear understanding of exactly what's going on, because every parcel had a commitment to it. Something was being implemented. There were deed restrictions and covenants on all the property, and they run in perpetuity. At least that's according to the 6th District Court case that we had. So let's make this perfectly clear instead of flopping around and such. Are the things that have been recorded, are they gonna stay, okay, in place? The master resolution, the reuse plan and such. Or is it all just gonna go away? See, that was never the intent, was that we were gonna spend decades of hard work and millions of dollars to get absolutely to the point of being nowhere. So I want an answer. My council wants an answer. The workers of this community want an answer, because there's a lot of politics being played here. And, you know, quite frankly, the jurisdictions have never, ever protected the businesses and the workers around here, and basically have taken their own greedy little interest in their partnerships and basically use them for themselves and not for the people of this community. So I want
Thank you,
an
Mr.
answer.
Cheshire.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any other members of the public with comments or questions? Seeing none, I believe. Well, I'll go ahead and bring it back to this board. I think Director Morton, you had another question, and then I'd like to be reminded what our hoped for action is on this item.
Thank you. So the question, I did have a question, but also what's on the screen is 2.2.6, and the idea that this transition plan assigns to MCWD FORA's right of enforcement under the implementation agreements. That is the type of language that is inappropriate in this document, and it appears in here in multiple locations. And that's to my comments earlier. But I wanted to go back into your recitals, and your recital B is one in particular that states that this document is incorporating Exhibit A. And I did have FORA staff send to me by email Exhibit A, and Exhibit A is a laundry list of contracts, many of which are lapsed in the sense that they've been fulfilled by their terms, their duration is over, etc. Is it feasible for us just to eliminate Exhibit A? I'm concerned also when this document, it's saying we're incorporating it by reference, as if that gives it, we're reaffirming those contracts. And so I would ask that to be addressed by Kendall or council. Thank you.
So Gail, I missed that one, and I apologize. We did go through and try to pull all of the references. And I think what I would like to suggest is this, kind of to answer that question, also to answer something that the chair just said. Though this document's been out for a while, we know that everybody's legal counsel are going to want to have even more time with it now that we know that it's real. And because there are some questions about whether or not the information provided us, or the questions asked from LAFCO with regard to assignment for Delray Oaks, whatever. So in terms of getting that in the transition plan, what would be extremely helpful, and I would suggest, is that I understand we may be having another meeting, and Josh, perhaps you'd like to go over what our plan might be, perhaps for bringing that back. But again, getting any other things, and Gail, I mean, you especially, any other notes that we need to be paying attention to so that I can get a cleaner version. I've heard from Hafa, from you, and from Jane about some things that need to be taken out. But if we can get those other requests or questions from other members, then we can get a clean version of this out and then have it considered again with the legal counsel weighing in on what can or cannot be in the transition plan based on their findings.
Yeah. Chair, would it be appropriate for me to add a few things here?
Sure.
Yeah, just to the point of our next meeting, as listed at the bottom of today's agenda, we've been requested by the bond counsel, who's been working with various jurisdiction legal teams to vet and refine the bond documents, that we hold a meeting on the 30th to look at least a significant portion of the bond documents. And so if there was interest in doing what Kendall suggested about doing more refinement to the transition plan, this could be an item added to that meeting agenda. Our hope is that we would also be able to bring completed memorandums of agreement between FORA and the city of Marina, the city of Seaside, and Delray Oaks regarding the CIP projects. That would also include the language on the lead agency status that LAFCO's been looking for at that time. So we have, if we do this April 30th meeting, that would be one of 5 remaining meetings. And it's impressive the number of items that crop up. And I think we're going to need all those meetings to get the work done that we have in front of us.
Thank you. Yes, and I would just say too that we're well over our meeting, our projected meeting end time. So I would propose, if there isn't any particular urgency, that we either move quickly to that last item to and through it, or if it can move to the April 30th meeting, maybe we do that. What's your thought on that?
Well, the last item could be handled quickly. It's basically a notification to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about the actions the board is taking and making the policy adjustments and the allocation of the funds for the habitat. So,
maybe let's leave the transition plan item. I think there's been some good conversation and feedback, plenty of work for Kendall to do in the next week or two. And then let's take up the letter, the last item on today's agenda. It seems like it makes sense. So hopefully, do you have a quick presentation on it, and then we'll
yes,
try to get through it.
Okay, hold on one moment. Oops, here we go. Stop participant sharing. I'm just gonna put up the board report because that's the quickest way to summarize this. You know, this is a letter that was requested by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that their staff would use to inform their higher ups about the new directions that are happening here with regard to the habitat conservation plan. So the letter is included in the packet, a draft of the letter. It describes the drivers of these related policy changes, deliberations of the Habitat Working Group, and the recommendations that have been brought to the board, and also includes mention of the board's action to continue to pursue the EIR certification. Then it concludes with a request for information from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about implications of these actions and whether there would be options available that could support, potential future permitting efforts. So it is a formal letter, and we wanted to make sure everyone was aware that this would be something that would be going out. It's, like I said, it's attached here, the draft. If you wanted to go through and look at the language, we could do that, or you could authorize us to send the letter. This was developed in collaboration with our HCP consultants and our full team.
Thank you. Any board member questions on this letter? I'm not seeing any board member hands.
I'm seeing three
yes, I do.
participants.
Director Morton.
So the question that I have, Josh, and the FORA board voted to proceed with the certification of the EIR. And in the workforce, the working group that we had on environmental
The
issues.
Habitat Working Group.
Thank you for the title, Habitat Working Group, great group of people. But one of the things that we learned was that the United States Fish and Wildlife Services is the lead agency for a base-wide permit from the federal government for the footprint of Fort Ord. And what we learned in that meeting also in talking with them is that they can complete that process as the lead agency even after FORA is sunset. So my question is, this is not my expertise in the writing of this letter, is this enabling them, if that EIR does get certified, for them to proceed as the lead agency to conclude the work as they indicated they would have the ability to do post-sunset of FORA?
Right, so that's addressed in, I think if you look at the staff report, the three key points that the letter includes as a request to the Fish and Wildlife Service with, about potential paths forward under the federal ESA and NEPA regulations, with the focus of the implications of officially withdrawing its ITP application, whether this could be amended by a different applicant at a later date. So I think that's what you were referring to there, or not completing the EIS at this time, and whether the NEPA compliance could be continued by a different applicant at a later time. So I think what this letter does is it formally describes what the policy actions are, and then asks for feedback in terms of options for the board to know about. Does that answer your question?
So you're trying to clarify if in fact they would go forward with their own EIS if they did get a certified EIR from us.
Yeah. Well, let's the specific asks for the service are included in the letter, and they're those that I described. If you want to look at the language and make an amendment or something that would address your specific question, we're open to suggestion here.
And it looks as though Erin Harwain has her hand up. She may be able to be helpful.
Erin, right?
Hi, this is Erin. I just wanted to clarify, some of the rationale from Fish and Wildlife Service to provide this letter was that this project is officially in their hopper. And what they're requesting, just based on the NEPA timeframe mandates, they want to be able to make a decision on where to put this in their hopper, whether this is going to continue forward under FORA, if someone else is going to pick up the baton later. But they need to make some decisions internally, whether to officially pause or, you know, put it on the back burner. So we wanted to make sure that we didn't suggest to put it on the back burner or pause without making sure that the jurisdictions had all the options available and that we weren't messing up something in the future. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. That's the options, keeping the option open and having them progress is exactly the question, and not communicating that we're not interested, especially if we complete the certification of the EIR, which they would rely on.
Right, and I think that's listed in one of the bullets about on the second page, maybe number 5, that you could receive the funds, form a JPA and move forward if you wanted to, and just to make sure you had your NEPA options, there you go, open in the future. Thank you.
Advanced.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other board members with questions or, well, questions at this point? I don't see any other hands raised. I'll go to the public then, and I see that, oh, wait, sorry, Director Wizard, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I was a little slow on the hand raising click. I guess I just have a clarifying question, whether it's for the executive officer or for Mr. Giffen, but you know, I'm concerned that perhaps the response is a little premature in that we have not wrapped up our business as it relates to the HCP. I understand that we're going to take a second vote at some point, and we might change our minds, and I don't want to send a letter trying to be prompt and professional to the Fish and Wildlife Service and then box ourselves into a decision that we don't necessarily want to pursue once we have a little more information or we get a little closer to June 30th. So to the extent that the letter could be more of a synopsis or a summary of things that have occurred so far without sort of delineating paths forward, I would be in favor of something like that. I just don't know how committal we want to be in this correspondence.
Yeah, just, you know, from my end, you know, I was contacted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with a request for communication in this regard to the point that Aaron described. You know, there's a 20-year history of interagency communication, some taking months and months to complete. So I don't think there would be any, you know, there's no imperative that this has to happen tomorrow. We simply had the request and wanted to bring it to you all to consider. So if the preference of the board is to delay, we can certainly make that happen.
Thank you. Director Gagliotti.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo John's sentiment. There are no quick topics in FORA. This is something I'd like to maybe discuss a little more detail in the next meeting. And since we do have a little runway here, I'd like to ask if we could just continue it.
Okay. Thank you. I'll go to the public now. I see that Sherry Damon has her hand up. So go ahead, Ms. Damon.
Yes, thank you, Chair, members of the board, Sherry Damon. I think I would concur with the comments of Director Gagliotti and Director Wizard. I think if we have time, as the letter is currently drafted, I'd be a little concerned that be sent out. There would be a concern that it might be a pre-decisional type of a letter, given that you haven't considered the final EIR yet. And taken a full and formal action, fully informed on the environmental document. And so I think the letter could be redrafted in a little bit more generic way to ask for some of those options. And I think I concur with Director Morton that keeping the underlying jurisdictions options open is a good thing. So, but I think the letter drafting needs.
Can't get her, ask her to touch base with us Monday, please.
So we would welcome, anyone with interest to submit, recommended modifications. We're open to that. This is a draft letter.
Great, thank you. Any other members of the public with comments or suggestions on this item? I'm not seeing any, and Josh, are you seeing people I don't see?
Not
Okay.
seeing any manual hand. Wait, there's a Doug Yount. I see a Doug Yount hand.
I think that may be left from before.
That's an old hand.
Yeah, he's an old hand. He can cope. Okay, so we'll bring it back to the board. It sounds as though there may be some interest in continuing to wordsmith this letter and maybe bring it back on April 30th.
Yeah, I guess that's a question of, because I heard a few different things. We could bring it back on the 30th. We could save it for a later meeting. You could add it to your, end of June action if you want. It's really up to you all as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. Well, then let's not worry about having it on the 30th necessarily. I see Director Morton has her hand up. Thank you.
So to the comment to leave it to June 30th, I don't agree with that, because if in fact they respond and we need to do something, we're gone. And the sooner that they give us their information of what their options are and how we can protect the interest of our jurisdictions in picking this up, to Aaron's point, if they're putting it on pause, who or what are the qualifications for stepping up and doing that, I would be most interested in having that come back to us quickly, so that if there needs to be some action taken by this board, we have the time to do it. So if in fact we are comfortable, what I would like to see is the concerns that were identified by the speakers, saying this is where we are. We took an action today that says we're going to allocate FORA's responsibility for the habitat management areas to the jurisdictions. We've come up with a formula. We do know the strategy that we're using. The EIR is going forward because that's a past action of the board saying to certify it, is to get that information in front of them and then ask them, how do we preserve and protect our rights and the 26 years of investment in this process? So again, to not be as specific, but general, but look for guidance. So it's an initial letter. I would like that to go out Monday. I think that's critical for us.
Okay. Any other board members with thoughts on this? So it sounds like I agree that making sure that we send the letter in time to get a response in case we need to do something, and so we sort of know where we are, makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like there's some work on the letter that might need to be done. And I see Director Oglesby has his hand up. Please go ahead.
I just want to agree with the chair. I don't think it's critical that it needs to go out Monday. We all need to take a look at what it says, but I agree with Director Morton about there's no need for us to get some feedback from them, but we're not around to answer the call. So by getting it out this Monday or within the next week, I don't think it's that critical.
All right, so let's see if we can bring it back on the 30th. We'll really load that agenda up so that we can go over time on that one too.
And just to all the speakers, Monday was hyperbole. Thank you. But I mean sooner rather than June 30th, sooner rather than later. Thank you.
As was June 30th. I'll go with the hyperbole on this end too. Fair enough. Go ahead.
So Monday is the new June 30th.
Right. Yes, Kendall Flint has a comment or a question.
Kendall, you're on mute.
Sorry. I know you wish for that every day, Josh. I'm so sorry. I was actually waiting for public comment period. If you're there, it sounds like
we
you're there.
did that already. Would you like to?
I'm just wanting to say I'm going to send out a updated version of the 2020 transition plan. Please help a sister out and send that to your legal teams and send me any other comments or things I might have missed so that we meet on the 30th. We can be, dare I say, unanimous in our support for this new document that I can address everything. So I will send that out likely early on Monday morning to everyone, through Harry actually, but also it's Steve's birthday and I have to go have birthday with him tonight in quarantine.
So it sounds like we will get something going out on Monday with no hyperbole. And I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were waiting for general public comment, which we hadn't gotten to yet. So let's move to that. Any members of the public wishing to make comments on items not on today's agenda? Breathing while we give people time to push buttons. And all right, I'm not seeing any. So are there any items, any further items from members for future meetings?
Just a reminder, if I might, about this. There's lots of meetings, and so I just want everyone to be clear that this next meeting we're talking about is Thursday, April 30th at 2 p.m.
Thank you. And we will see everyone then. We are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.